him. He specializes in issues involving environmental policy. He's held a variety of positions in both the professional public policy organization. He has spoken all around the country. He has certainly been all over the media with many of his studies. I would say he's one of the few minds in the country that really able to hone in on both the environmental or the economic position on issues that come forward. And so, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like for you to listen to Dr. Burnett.
Thank you for having me today. I'm going to start off with a fairly scandalous statement. At the outset, I would argue that regardless of human attribution of global warming, we are not really, or ought not to be really, worried about CO2 emissions or continued modest warming at all. That what we ought to be worried about, or what we are really concerned about, is the impacts of a warmer world, regardless of the cause. We ought not to be worried about CO2 because, quite frankly, CO2, unlike these other things that are true pollutants, isn't toxic to humans at any level we can foresee. It's not chemically harmful to us until you reach many, many parts per million higher than we're expecting. We are not worried about warming of 2 or 3 degrees. We see that not only daily but seasonally. People retire to Florida, not Minnesota. Phoenix, not North Dakota. There's a reason for that. They're not overly concerned about the warming when they do so. So, whatever warming we have, it's going to be regional. It's going to be modest, primarily in colder regions at night during the winter. Arguably, it could have more beneficial consequences than harmful. Having said this, to the extent that warming is a concern, it's because of the harmful effects it might have. Higher sea levels, more flooding, spread of tropical diseases, possible food scarcity, those types of things. With this in mind, I want to argue with regards to the proposals that have been put forward to prevent further warming, or to at least slow warming. A little cure is not enough, and enough cure is way too much. What we would have to do to really prevent warming would be far more harmful than the impacts of warming itself. As an example of a little cure, Kyoto. Many of us, when it first came out, did not think of Kyoto as a modest step. But it is modest with regard to what it would take to actually prevent or appreciably slow warming. According to the National Center for Atmospheric Research, even if all the signatories to the Kyoto Protocol met their greenhouse gas reduction targets, even if the U.S. was on board, every other country that was party to it signed up, kept their did the reductions they're supposed to do, no cheating. It would only reduce warming by 2050 of less than 0.07 degrees. By 2100, less than a fifth of a degree cooler than it would absent Kyoto. So that's a small step. It would take 5 Kyotos to equal a degree to really prevent serious warming. Some people have predicted it would take 20 Kyotos. Now, you look at the much more stringent. Now, used to be the domestic legislation proposed was less stringent than Kyoto. The ones that are being proposed right now are much more stringent than Kyoto. For instance, some of them would say we got to cut emissions 80% by 2050. 80% is no small amount. We'll get back to that in a second. Now, the NCPA published a report back in 1999 by Vice President and Senior Economist of the Dallas Federal Reserve Bank. And he looked at Kyoto as if we were purchasing insurance, because they say, look, it's insurance against a bad future. And he said, if Kyoto is insurance, it's a bad insurance policy because it represents we're buying way too much insurance. He indicated that if you had the best climate policy, if Washington put its mind to it and came up with the best climate policy, and it was implemented perfectly, and everybody complied well, and they found the most efficient technologies to meet the climate policy, So the best of all possible scenarios, and we all know that's rarely the case, but imagine a possible world where everything was done correctly and it worked fine. He said it would still cost us 3 to 4.3% of our gross domestic product, representing a loss between $921 to $1,320 for every man, woman, and child in the country. So for a family of 4, you're talking almost $5,000 per household. Now, he said the right level of insurance, if we were really going to do something, he said we ought to do about 14% of that required by Kyoto. 14%. So less than a fifth of Kyoto. Kyoto would require 7 times more CO2 reduction by the United States than justified by comparison of cost benefits. That's his assessment. Now, further support for this idea came from Danish scholar Bjorn Lomborg. In 2004, he put together what's called the Copenhagen Consensus. You may all be familiar with this. Some of you may not. It included 3 Nobel Prize laureates. They were 8 very noted economists, and they said if there were $50 billion in resources at government's disposal, an additional $50 billion, what problems ought we to address? And of the 17 proposals, they looked at 10 problems. 17 proposals to deal with the 10 problems. 3 of them dealt with climate change. The 3 that dealt with climate change came in dead last, 15, 16, and 17. According to the Copenhagen Consensus, every dollar spent fighting AIDS would provide about $40 in benefits. Every dollar fighting malnutrition, $30 in benefits. Every dollar fighting malaria directly would produce $15 in benefits. For climate change, it would provide 20 to 25 cents in benefits for every dollar spent. Having said this, Lomborg, in his most recent book, Cool It, suggests that we still ought to perhaps have a carbon tax of about $2 a ton. Now, it's not very high. It's at the very, very low end of anything anybody is proposing. In fact, it's lower than anything anybody is proposing. He gets this from Richard Toll, an economist who's done a lot of work on this, and he says that a reasonable carbon tax is between $2 and $14 a ton. That's hedging his bet. But when asked directly, he says really it's closer to the low end of $2 a ton. Now, now I worked with the Federal Reserve when we published this study. My question has always been, why ought we to buy 14% of the insurance? And for Lomborg, I'd say, why pay a $2 a ton carbon tax? And the reason I say why is this. If Kyoto itself won't have an appreciable effect in reducing warming, and the harms, and one would presume the harms caused by it, and these proposals will only prevent a fraction of Kyoto's warming and the harms caused by them, then why should we undertake them at all? You know, why undertake these very, very small, not even halfway measures? It seems to me that we shouldn't be doing something for window dressing. In addition, the belief that we must act now, it seems to me, is based on the idea that we have near-term consequences that would be catastrophic and prudence supports immediate government action. But there's a lot of research that indicates that's not the case. In fact, a 1995 analysis by proponents, people who believe global warming is happening, it's serious, we've got to do something about it. Thomas Wigley, a few others, Wigley, Richard Richels, J.A. Edmonds, they said that we could wait up to 25 years or until 2020, because this was done in 1995, to take action to prevent warming and have no appreciable negative effects. We get the same bang for the buck waiting 25 years as we could do now. But the benefits of delaying action is that it would cost much lower in the future to do it because our technologies would be improved. Older technologies would already be naturally going offline. We wouldn't be taking power plants off prematurely. They'd be going off on time and being replaced with cleaner technologies. Markets would be better able to adapt and to judge what we have to adapt to with climate change. and we'd have a better knowledge. So it seems to me buying the $2 insurance or buying the 14% insurance, even that's way too much. But let's go back to the buying the whole package, which is what do we have to do to really prevent climate change? Remember, Kyoto won't do that. Looking at the recent McCain-Lieberman bill, and by the way, I heard someone say today that none of the presidential candidates doesn't support a carbon tax. That's not true. None of the major presidential candidates doesn't support a carbon tax. Ron Paul's dead against any carbon tax or cap and trade program to fight climate change. He may not have much of a chance in winning, but you can't be out there and say that everybody supports a carbon tax. It's not true. Steve Hayward, a friend of mine, did a little back-of-the-envelope calculation. The McCain-Lieberman bill says we've got to cut carbon emissions 80%. Now, he said, when was the last time we were at carbon emission levels in America where we were 80% lower than we are right now? And it turns out that it was around 1920. But wait, it doesn't stop there. Because you've got to remember that by 2050, which is when they want to cut the 80% by, our population will be much higher than it is now. So he said, when was the last time per capita we were at those levels? And it turns out it was between 1860 and 1870. So yes, we can cut carbon emissions that much. All we have to do is have the standard of living of Nigeria. Now, some people may be willing to make that kind of sacrifice. I know some people from a group called Earth First. You don't hear much about them anymore, but their motto used to be back to the Pleistocene. If that's the way you want to live, we can have those carbon emission cuts. If not, this is where I say it's way too much. Now, having said that, having said that, does that mean that we shouldn't do anything in response to future warming? My answer, of course, is no. That we should do something, but if not with regard to CO2 emissions or with regard to climate change, but with regard to the impacts of a warmer world. What climate change or warming is expected to do is exacerbate problems that we already face. On the very, very far out scenarios, the very fringe scenarios, it's expected to create whole new kinds of problems, like the coming ice age, instant snowball Earth, those types of things, very far out scenarios. But under most and all the reasonable scenarios, it's expected to just exacerbate problems that we first face right now, like tropical diseases. Would modestly increase the spread of tropical diseases. It would modestly increase the rate of sea level rise. I got news. Absent global warming, sea level rise will continue until when? The next ice age comes, because that's what happens between ice ages. It will modestly expand the amount of flooding. So the question is, we face these problems already. Is there a response that gets at these problems? And Ender Gaklani, a friend of mine who I believe is here, though I don't see him in the audience, I haven't seen him. He wrote a paper for us, and he concluded that mitigation in some cases has small benefits, but the costs are substantial, whereas adaptation can produce the same or greater benefits. And so, for instance, meeting the CO2 reductions by Kyoto, required by Kyoto, would cost an estimated $165 billion annually. So over 100 years, you're talking, trillions of dollars. It would reduce the population at risk for malaria by 0.2%. Not 2%, 0.2%. It would reduce the population at risk of hunger from 1.5 to 2%. It would reduce the population at risk of coastal flooding by 18%. More aggressive proposals to cap carbon emissions at 550 parts per million, which is a doubling of pre-industrial levels approximately. They would cost trillions of dollars. The final figure hasn't been calculated. They just know it's above trillions, multiple trillions. How much malaria would we prevent by doing that? 0.4%. Population facing hunger would reduce that by 9.7%. Population at risk from coastal flooding, pretty substantial, 80%. But, he said, a multi-pronged focused adaptation approach would cost, just to solve these three problems, about $10 billion annually. And he went through some other problems. I don't have time to do them all. So for $10 billion, what we would get through adaptation, we could cut the population at risk from death from malaria in half starting next year, not 100 years from now, reducing deaths by 500,000 to 1 million a year. We would cut the population at risk of hunger by 50% beginning today, not in 2085 or 2100. We would reduce the number of people at risk from flooding along the coast by almost 100%, depending on decisions they make, but it puts the onus on them. And it would reduce it now into the future. Now, what are some of these adaptive mechanisms? Well, for malaria, look, we have the technologies today to cut malaria in half, if we had the political will to use it. DDT is effective. And I'm not just talking about bed nets. Bed nets are nice if you stay in bed all day. But most people I know don't. Spraying the inside walls of houses where the mosquitoes stay until they come out at night, much more effective. Getting the most effective anti-malarial drugs. Cost about $3 billion annually, no small sum, but much less than $165 billion to prevent 0.2% of cases 100 years from now, with a huge payoff. What about coastal flooding? Well, there are some places that we are not going to want to give up. May require building sea walls, may require building up the coast. What's clear is the sea level rise that we're expecting in the next century is no greater. It's about the same as the sea level rise we are experiencing the last century. In the century before that, we adapted to that. We prevented flooding despite that. But in some cases, you know, it would require no longer, and this seems to me to be a win-win situation, but then I'm a fiscal conservative. Currently, we subsidize the destruction of coastal wetlands, and we subsidize the development along the coast by subsidized flood insurance and subsidized hurricane insurance. We encourage people to build where we expect natural disasters to occur. So when a flood comes, we rebuild them right in the same place. You and me, the taxpayer. They don't ever cover their own costs. And of course, New Orleans is a beautiful and sad example of that in the sense that here we have people that the people who bought flood insurance, they're getting rebuilt, but their neighbors who didn't buy flood insurance are also getting rebuilt. Now, what does that tell the people that paid for this reduced price flood insurance? They were suckers. Because if they hadn't bought it in the first place, so next time they just won't buy it. So the taxpayer will be bailing out even more people. Well, if we just stop doing those types of things, many people wouldn't be building along the coast. Insurers are very concerned about the rising cost of coastal disasters. And they want to blame global warming because they want to say, well, if it's society's fault, we shouldn't have to pay for society's mistakes. But the truth is, they're paying more now, not because hurricanes are getting worse or flooding is getting worse, but because the kinds of things they're insuring on the coast are much more expensive now, and the value of property along the coast is much higher now than it was at any time in the future. And by 2050, we're expecting 70% of our population to live within 25 miles of the coast. So you can expect these costs to rise regardless of warming. And if we take some preventive policies now, like ending subsidized flood insurance and ending subsidized hurricane insurance, so people bear those risks themselves, you may build there the first time on your own dime, but it's doubtful you'll do it the second and third time. For flood insurance, some of these homes have been rebuilt 4 times at taxpayer expense. So these are the types of mechanisms that anyway, I've proposed. Sorry. Ended on time for once in my life.